Hello everyone, I'm Cynthia Miller, and before I start any art project, I get out my essential oil, the Balance Blend with doTERRA. It helps me to feel grounded, and it just lets the rest of the world dissolve away in the background. I think it's very important that we're here in this moment. Now I'm going to be using some colors, pointing out here the burnt umber, the yellow ochre, the dusk green, and it's very simple, just having them in my pie plate. I've got a little stencil here, and we're going to be first drawing this stencil, and there's a color card that I use as well. We're going to draw this stencil on the paper, but we must prepare it first. We're going to paint the first layer a very light tone of green. So I've got a couple of different greens lined up. I've mixed a few together with the browns to make a little bit of a moss green, and as I mentioned, the dusk green is a favorite of mine, although it's quite dark. I'm just sprinkling some water on here, spreading it around for that first layer. So we're just sprinkling on some paint along with some water, and just remembering that this is going to be the very first very light tone. And as you build it up, you can use the same color of paint, or you can add a little bit darker tone to the paint. Every layer that you put on the next layer and the next layer, it gets darker and darker, and that's just how the watercolor works. So that's why I'm saying you can use the same paint that you have already mixed up, or you can continue to add a little bit darker color to it. Now we're going to take this and dry it with a hair dryer. Just put it on medium heat and hold it about 4 or 6 inches away. I've got my template here, and I'm starting to draw it on. And in hindsight, I think I would have made this template a little bit smaller, just based on the size of the paper that I'm using, which is about 7 by 11 inches. And the Clover seems to be a little bit large, but it works. I'm still using it. You're going to have about 4 for the first layer, and so just place them strategically. Now you don't have to have the little stem if that sort of doesn't work for you, but I wanted them to look like they are growing, and so that's why I wanted to put the little stem there. And of course another idea would be to do all 3-leaf clovers and just have maybe one 4-leaf clover, because of course you don't see very many patches of clover that are all 4 leaves. So it's just whatever you want it to be. So you can see I've used just a really light pencil mark to trace these on, and just sort of flipping them over, making them a little bit different from one side to the next, and just taking my time just tracing those out. So it'll take a little bit of time to get everything traced, but basically you want to trace 4 of those. Now you don't necessarily have to stick to 4 if you have a smaller shape. I was thinking you could do this with hearts as well. You know, you could just gauge the composition of the size of your paper and the size of the template. So here I've started to paint around the background of the shapes of the clover that I've drawn onto the paper, and I'm using 140-pound paper, so it's going to withstand a lot of water. So as each layer goes on, then there's going to be more water and more paint on top of that. So I'm just going to draw around the outside of the shapes, and so I'm actually applying the paint to the negative part of the picture, so it's not actually coloring the leaves, it's the background behind the leaves. Okay, so we've finished painting the background of the clovers, and we have dried it with the hairdryer again, and we're just going to place on the second layer of the stencils. Now when you place this second layer on, you're going to remember this is behind the first layer, so you don't want to take your pencil lines over top of the clovers that you put in the first layer. These will go behind the first layer, and so that's really important that you remember that. You're not going to trace over top. it's going to be behind. So you can see that tracing is behind the first layer. We don't take the pencil lines over top of the white. So this one again will be behind. So I'm just doing partial tracing now of the leaves of the clover that meet up with the first layer. And we'll just continue to do that. I'm going to put 4 more clovers in the sort of negative space behind the first layer. So we're just finishing up tracing out the 4th clover, and so we've got the second layer of clovers in place behind the first layer. And in a minute we'll start painting, and what we're going to do is paint the background of now what is behind that second layer of stencils, and also the background in the first layer. So it's yeah, you sort of have to keep track of what it is that you're painting in every level, in every layer. So just going around the first layer as well as the second layer with a tone that's just a little bit darker. So this is the 3rd depth of color that we're putting in here. We've got the first set of clover quite light. The second layer of clover has been traced, and now we're using the deeper tone of green to outline the background. So we're just going to continue around the outline of the first and second layer of the stencils with this just a little bit darker, a little bit deeper tone of green. And this is really where it starts to come together, where you start to see the layers, and it starts to make sense how the negative painting works, where the every layer starts to show up a little bit more as you add that deeper tone. So we'll just move around each layer a little bit darker. Now I like to have my watercolor paper on a board so that I can move it around, because sometimes it's a little difficult to get to the other side of the paper. Sometimes the angles aren't quite right. So if you're able to do that, just work on one section at a time, and it makes it a whole lot easier. So as you can see, I'm just working around the second layer of shapes as we put on that darker tone. So we've pretty much completed the painting for the background of the first and second layer, and we're now placing the 3rd layer of clovers. And so you have to go where there's room to trace it, and remember that this is behind the original layer and behind the second layer. So I'm not crossing the drawing over top, it's behind. So we're just going to add another 4 clovers in the spaces behind the original clovers, and sometimes it's hard to find that space, but just partials of the clover behind are going to do the trick for you, because once you start painting the next layer of tone, it will be a little bit darker, and you'll start to see another layer appear. Okay, so we're starting to put on the next layer of a darker tone. You've traced the template to make the 3rd layer of clover leaves, and we're starting to put on just a little bit darker and just sticking to the background. And so you really have to watch what sections now you're painting, but it really does start to come together at this point. You can really start to see how the layers are being built up, and the darker tones really help to bring out. So you're not painting the leaf structure, you're painting the background. Now, one of the things that I use is a piece of paper towel to place under my hand while I'm painting in the center of the picture. It prevents any transference of paint and doesn't sort of muck things up underneath. And I find this is a really good tip to do. Just make sure it's clean And you don't want to put it on top of wet paint, but it does help if it's a little bit dampish. Now you can see as you start to fill in those tiny little spaces between the different layers of the clover that it really starts to look like it has more depth. And so one of the things that you want to remember is that every layer that you put on, the tone must be consistent from one side of the paper to the other. You want that to look like it is the same layer as on the other side of the clover, for example. So here I am just adding another layer. You might have to sort of, to watch that consistent tone, you might have to add another layer to keep that tone the same. And I've just switched the board around so that I can access this side of the artwork a little easier. It's a lot easier than reaching across the artwork. Okay, so just finishing up by filling in those little slices of green in the background, and it really does help to make it consistent when you sort of look at the layers, what you're doing from one side to the other. Very important that you keep that consistent, and just making it a little bit darker every layer. Now we put one more layer of clovers in the back, and we filled in the darker tones, and I decided that the lighter colored clovers didn't look realistic to me. They looked too white. They had really dried, very light color. So I decided to put a little bit of water on them and add a little bit of that sort of mossy sap green to the front to just give them a little bit more depth. I wanted them to look like leaves. I didn't want them to look sort of bleached out. So I just took each one and just did one at a time, put a little bit of water on it, and just added the color in there, and just sort of made it look more like there was separation in those clover leaves as well. So just finishing up here, and make sure you check out shiftyourcar.com for our weekly paint circles. Thanks for watching.